Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Manga Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The house was quiet when Marcus stepped inside. The kind of quiet that settled deep into the bones. It was unsettling for a Saturday evening. Normally, Isabella would have music playing while she worked on her latest campaign, or at least the soft hum of the television would fill the silence. Tonight, nothing. He dropped his briefcase by the door, the metallic clang against the tile startling in the stillness. Something felt off. Marcus couldn't name it, but his instincts, honed by years of courtroom battles and meticulous preparation, bristled at the anomaly. "Isabella?" he called, his voice steady, authoritative, but met only with silence. He found her in the kitchen, sitting at the marble island with a glass of wine in hand. Her long dark hair cascaded over one shoulder, and her makeup, always flawless, seemed untouched despite the late hour. She didn't look up when he entered, her focus fixed on the glass. "You're home early," she said finally, her tone distant. Marcus noted the way her fingers traced the rim of the glass, a small, nervous gesture. He'd seen it before, in depositions when a witness wasn't quite prepared for what was coming. "Traffic was light," he replied, setting his jacket on the back of a chair. "What's going on?" Isabella sighed, a sound so weighted it felt like it could crack the tension in the room. She finally looked up, and Marcus saw something in her eyes he couldn't immediately decipher. Guilt, perhaps, but layered with something more complex. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice trembling ever so slightly. The words hung in the air, each one a thread pulling at Marcus's carefully woven world. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms in a posture of patience, though his pulse quickened. "I've made a mistake," she said, her gaze dropping back to the glass. "A terrible mistake." Marcus didn't flinch. Years of arguing cases before skeptical judges had taught him the value of remaining unreadable. "Go on," he prompted, his tone betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. Isabella exhaled sharply, her hand trembling as she placed the glass down. "I've been seeing someone." The word struck like a gavel, definitive and irreversible. Marcus felt the world tilt for a moment, his sense of control slipping, but he didn't move, didn't react. He let the words settle. "For how long?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost conversational. 6 months, she admitted. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I never meant—" "Who?" Marcus interrupted, his question direct and clinical. He needed details, not justifications. Isabella hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Daniel," she said, the name a barely audible whisper. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Daniel, a name he knew, a face he could picture too well, a mutual friend, or so he'd thought. The room felt colder now, the sleek, modern design of their kitchen turning sterile. Marcus straightened, his mind already sifting through possibilities, strategies, outcomes. "And what now?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to make Isabella flinch. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought you deserved the truth." Marcus studied her, his piercing green eyes unyielding. She'd just detonated the foundation of their life, and now she sat there waiting for him to gather the pieces. "You're right about that," he said finally. "I do deserve the truth, all of it." Isabella's expression faltered, her confidence crumbling under his gaze. I, I don't know if—" "Spare me the hesitation," Marcus cut in. "From this moment on, there's no place for half-truths between us. If you want to fix this, or even end it, then you owe me complete honesty." The challenge hung in the air, and for the first time, Isabella looked like she didn't know how to respond. Marcus didn't wait for her. He turned, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "To think," he said, not looking back, "and to decide whether your mistake is worth destroying everything we've built." The door closed behind him with a decisive thud. Marcus stood on the porch, the chill of the evening air biting against his skin. The battle between his sense of justice and his growing thirst for retribution roared to life, and he knew this was only the beginning. Marcus sat in his car, the faint glow of the dashboard lighting his face. He didn't start the engine. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against his skin. The world outside blurred as his thoughts churned, replaying Isabella's confession like a broken record. Daniel, of all people. The betrayal felt calculated. This wasn't just a random indiscretion. This was someone who had sat at their table, shared drinks and laughter with them, someone who had toasted to their anniversaries. Marcus's mind, sharp as ever, began piecing together moments that once seemed innocuous, but now felt tainted. A glance too long, a laugh too loud, a pattern hidden in plain sight. He forced himself to breathe, to ground his thoughts. The temptation to confront Daniel immediately was overwhelming, but Marcus knew better. Anger was impulsive, unstrategic. If he wanted to regain control, he needed clarity, not chaos. The following morning, Marcus arrived at his office earlier than usual. His secretary, Carla, looked up in surprise as he strode in. "Coffee, black," he said curtly, not breaking stride. He closed his office door and locked it behind him, a rare move that made Carla's brows furrow. Inside, Marcus sank into his chair, the city skyline stretching behind him. He booted up his laptop, his fingers tapping impatiently as he accessed a private investigator's contact, a man named Harris, who had helped him before on a tricky corporate case. The call was brief. Marcus didn't elaborate on the personal nature of his request. Harris was a professional who didn't need context to deliver results. Marcus requested everything: Daniel's financial records, his recent movements, and any connections that might illuminate the depth of the affair. Marcus's legal mind told him to gather evidence methodically, to uncover the full picture before acting. After the call, he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His mind wandered to Isabella. She had always been vibrant, magnetic, a force that drew everyone in, including him. What had changed? When had the cracks started forming? Was it his long hours at the firm, the late nights spent poring over briefs and contracts, while she was left alone? He wasn't blind to his shortcomings, but shortcomings weren't justifications. They weren't an excuse for her to seek comfort in the arms of someone else, someone he trusted. By midday, Marcus had begun combing through their finances. Isabella was meticulous about money, but there had been unexplained charges recently. Spa trips, luxury hotels, dinners at places he hadn't frequented. The pieces clicked together now. Those weren't indulgences for herself. They were rendezvous with Daniel. Carla knocked softly at the door, interrupting his spiral. "Mr. Harper, your coffee." He nodded, muttering a quick thanks, and she hesitated. "Is everything all right?" Marcus glanced up, surprised by her concern. He opened his mouth to lie, to brush her off with a perfunctory response, but something in her gaze stopped him. "Do you think people are capable of truly hiding who they are?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Carla tilted her head, taken aback. "I think people can hide parts of themselves for a while, but not forever." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Carla." As she left, her words lingered. Could Isabella have been hiding a version of herself all this time? Or had something changed, some unseen catalyst that pushed her toward betrayal? That evening, Marcus returned home, his movements deliberate as he entered the house. Isabella was in the living room, curled on the couch with a book. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary. "You're home," she said softly, setting the book aside. Marcus noted the way her fingers traced the rim of the glass, a small, nervous gesture. He'd seen it before, in depositions when a witness wasn't quite prepared for what was coming. "I've been thinking," he began, choosing his words carefully, "about what you said last night, about us." Isabella swallowed hard. And I have questions," he said, sitting across from her. "How did it start? What led you there?" Her gaze dropped to her hands. "Marcus, it wasn't—" "Don't downplay it," he interrupted. "Not now. If we're going to get through this, I need the truth." She hesitated, then nodded. It started innocently. Conversations at events, texts about work. He was attentive in ways I hadn't felt in a while. And before I knew it, it escalated. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Did you ever think of me? Of what this would do to us?" Tears brimmed in her eyes. "I did. I hated myself for it, but I felt invisible, Marcus. You've been so consumed with work, with winning cases and climbing ladders. I didn't know how to reach you anymore." Her words stung, but they didn't excuse the betrayal. Marcus leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You made your choices," he said finally, "and now I'll make mine." Isabella's face crumpled, but Marcus stood, the conversation over. Upstairs, he closed the bedroom door and sat in the dark. His mind raced with possibilities: forgiveness, revenge, or walking away entirely. Each option was a labyrinth of emotions, and he had no map to navigate it. The morning sun spilled into the dining room, highlighting the untouched coffee on the table in front of Marcus. He sat with his arms folded, staring at his phone. The private investigator, Harris, had sent a text half an hour earlier. "Meeting at 10 a.m. Results are substantial." Marcus's mind raced as he imagined the possibilities. Substantial? What did Harris mean by that? He didn't need to imagine long. Whatever was hidden beneath the surface of Isabella and Daniel's betrayal would soon be uncovered. At precisely 10 a.m., Marcus entered a nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and printer ink. Harris's office was as no-nonsense as the man himself. A plain desk, 2 chairs, and a corkboard pinned with papers and photos. Harris, a wiry man with sharp eyes, gestured for Marcus to sit. "I've got the full picture," Harris said, sliding a folder across the desk. "And it's bigger than I expected." Marcus opened the folder, his lawyer's mind immediately assessing the contents. Photos, financial statements, and transcripts of messages painted a damning picture. The affair wasn't just a fling. It was methodical, calculated. Daniel and Isabella had been meeting for months, often using Marcus's social obligations and late work nights as their cover. There were receipts for a shared account Marcus had no knowledge of, credit card transactions for jewelry, and hotel stays. The timeline stretched back almost a year. "It's not just personal," Harris continued, tapping the folder. "It's financial. They've been working together on more than just extracurricular activities." Marcus looked up, his piercing green eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Harris pulled out another document. Daniel convinced Isabella to invest in a business opportunity, a property development project. She used money from your joint savings account to fund it. The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. He flipped through the papers, his heart pounding as he read the details. Isabella had siphoned over $75,000 from their account. The transactions were cleverly disguised, small, frequent withdrawals that added up over time. "Well, didn't I notice this?" Marcus muttered, more to himself than Harris. "She covered her tracks well," Harris replied, "but the real kicker, the project is under Daniel's name. He's listed as the sole proprietor." Marcus leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial. Isabella hadn't just broken his trust, she had jeopardized their future for a man whose only real investment was deceit. "Isabella doesn't know," Harris said. "But Daniel's project is failing. The property market's tanked, and he's drowning in debt." A cold fury settled over Marcus. He wasn't just a victim of infidelity, he was a victim of fraud. But more than that, he realized, Isabella might also have been a pawn in Daniel's game. Back home, Marcus sat in his study, the folder spread across his desk. His mind whirred as he tried to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. He hadn't yet confronted Isabella. He didn't trust himself to stay composed, not after discovering how deep the betrayal went. Instead, he turned to his laptop. Years as a lawyer had taught him to prepare meticulously. He began drafting documents, one to separate their finances immediately, another to secure the house and protect his assets. If Isabella had chosen to gamble their future with Daniel, she wouldn't take him down with her. That evening, Isabella walked into the study, a hesitant smile on her face. She held 2 glasses of wine, offering one to Marcus. "I thought we could talk," she said softly. Marcus accepted the glass but didn't drink. He closed his laptop and gestured for her to sit. "Yes, let's talk." Isabella perched on the edge of the chair, her body language tentative. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I want you to know how sorry I am." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and tears welled in her eyes. "I made a mistake, Marcus. A terrible mistake. But I love you. I don't want to lose you." uh, um, Marcus studied her carefully. Was this genuine regret or the guilt of being caught? "Do you love Daniel?" he asked, his tone clinical. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "No, I thought I did, but it was never real. It was, I don't know, a distraction, an escape." Marcus leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "An escape from what? From me?" Isabella opened her mouth to answer, but hesitated. Finally, she said, "From the feeling of being invisible. You're always working, always thinking 10 steps ahead. I felt like I didn't matter anymore." Marcus felt a pang of guilt but quickly buried it. "And did Daniel make you feel visible? Important?" "Yes," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But it was a lie. I see that now. He doesn't care about me the way you do. He never did." Marcus stood, pacing the room. He wanted to believe her, but the evidence on his desk told a different story. "This isn't just about feelings, Isabella," he said, his voice rising. "You took our money. You lied to me. About him. About everything." Isabella's face crumpled. "I didn't know what to do. He said it was an investment, that it would help us both. I believed him." "And now?" Marcus asked, his tone cutting. "What do you believe now?" She didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. The following days brought a chill to the Harper household that no amount of autumn sunlight could warm. Marcus kept his interactions with Isabella brief and to the point, a stark contrast to their once lively banter. For Isabella, the silence was suffocating, but she knew better than to push him. Marcus, however, wasn't merely stewing in anger, he was planning. The weight of betrayal hadn't crushed him, it had sharpened him, and now he was determined to take control of the situation, piece by calculated piece. Late one evening, Marcus sat alone in his study. his laptop humming softly on the desk. Harris had sent another batch of documents earlier, this time highlighting Daniel's failing property venture in meticulous detail. Marcus pored over the reports, each line deepening his understanding of the financial quagmire his wife's lover had created. Daniel's project wasn't just teetering on the edge of collapse, it was actively sinking, its debts outweighing any potential revenue by a wide margin. Contractors had stopped working, legal notices piled up, and the bank had begun foreclosure proceedings. Marcus smirked grimly. The so-called businessman was little more than a con artist. The next move became clear. Marcus picked up the phone and dialed an old college friend, Rebecca Torres, a sharp corporate attorney with a reputation for dismantling shady operations. Rebecca had once joked that her specialty was burying idiots under mountains of their own bad decisions. "Rebecca," Marcus began, "I need your help, confidentially." By the time their conversation ended, Marcus had outlined his plan. Rebecca would initiate legal proceedings to separate Marcus's assets from Isabella's, shielding his finances from any fallout. Simultaneously, she would prepare to expose Daniel's fraudulent schemes to the authorities, ensuring that his ruin would be swift and absolute. "Anything else?" Rebecca asked, her voice dry but amused. Marcus hesitated for a moment. "Yes. I want Isabella to understand exactly what she's done and what it's cost us both." Rebecca paused. "Careful, Marcus. Revenge has a way of taking more than it gives." "It's not revenge," Marcus replied firmly. "It's justice." The next evening, Isabella found Marcus in the living room, reviewing a thick binder of legal documents. She hesitated in the doorway, her arms crossed protectively. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. Marcus glanced up, his expression unreadable. "What about?" "About us," she said, stepping closer. "About fixing this." He closed the binder, setting it aside with deliberate care. "Fixing this," he repeated, as if testing the words. "How do you propose we do that, Isabella?" "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice trembling. "Therapy, counseling, anything. I just want to make things right." Marcus studied her, the flickering firelight casting shadows across his sharp features. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he asked quietly. "Not just to me, but to yourself, to us." Isabella's tears began to flow again. "I do, Marcus. I was selfish. I was stupid. I let myself be swept up in something that meant nothing." "Nothing?" Marcus's voice hardened. "You risked our marriage, our savings, our future, on nothing." She sank to the couch, burying her face in her hands. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm begging you, Marcus, don't give up on me. Don't give up on us." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I'll make you a deal," he said, his tone measured. "You want to fix this? Then you'll help me fix what you broke. Completely. No hesitation, no complaints." Isabella looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Of course, anything." "Good," he said, standing, "because the first step is unraveling Daniel's mess." Her face paled. "What do you mean?" "I mean the money you gave him, the lies he told you. You're going to help me expose him for what he is." Isabella hesitated, fear flashing across her face. "Marcus, if we do that, he'll—" "What?" Marcus interrupted, his voice icy. "Try to drag you down with him? That ship has already sailed, Isabella. You chose to trust him. Now you'll face the consequences." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Isabella, true to her word, provided Marcus with every detail of her interactions with Daniel: emails, texts, bank records. Nothing was spared. It was humiliating for her, but Marcus showed no sympathy. Meanwhile, Rebecca moved swiftly. Within a week, she had filed the necessary paperwork to secure Marcus's finances and had launched an investigation into Daniel's property venture. The evidence mounted quickly, and it wasn't long before law enforcement took notice. By the time the first subpoenas were issued, Daniel's empire had crumbled. Contractors and investors who had been duped came forward, each new revelation painting a more damning picture of his deceit. Isabella watched from the sidelines, her guilt a constant shadow over her every move. One night, as the fallout reached its peak, Marcus and Isabella sat together in the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense of quiet between them. Not peace, but something close to it. "Do you think we can ever come back from this?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus considered her question carefully. "I don't know," he admitted. "Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. And some wounds, they don't heal." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." "We'll see," Marcus said, his tone guarded. "But know this, I'm not the same man I was before. And you're not the same woman." As the night wore on, Marcus retreated to his study, leaving Isabella alone with her thoughts. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The scales of justice had been tipped, and Marcus was determined to keep them balanced. The gala was a glittering affair, with laughter, music, and champagne flowing freely beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Riverton Hotel. Marcus stood near the entrance, surveying the crowd with an air of detachment. The room was filled with familiar faces, colleagues, acquaintances, and even a few of the mutual friends he and Isabella had shared with Daniel. It was the perfect stage for the final act of a drama that had consumed his life. Isabella was at his side, her movements stiff and careful. She wore a deep emerald gown that matched the sharpness of Marcus's eyes. Her beauty was undeniable, but tonight she seemed weighed down by an invisible burden. The fear of what was to come hung between them like an unspoken truth. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the far side of the room, where Daniel was laughing with a small group of guests. The man looked as confident as ever, his charm on full display. But Marcus knew better. Beneath that polished exterior was a man on the brink of collapse, oblivious to the storm about to hit. "Yes," Marcus said finally, "I'm sure." The evening unfolded like a carefully orchestrated performance. Marcus moved through the room with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and shaking hands, all while keeping a watchful eye on Daniel. Isabella trailed behind him, quieter than usual, but her presence served as a reminder of the stakes at hand. At precisely 9 o'clock, Marcus stepped onto the small stage set up for the night's speeches. The room quieted as he tapped the microphone, his commanding presence drawing attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "thank you for being here tonight. As many of you know, we gather not just to celebrate, but to support causes that matter deeply to our community. But before we continue, I'd like to address something personal." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Isabella's knuckles turned white as she clutched her champagne flute. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his confident smile faltering for the first time. Marcus paused, letting the tension build. "In recent months, I've had the misfortune of discovering betrayal in its most personal form, both in my marriage and my trust in a friend. Betrayal that goes beyond the personal and extends into matters of deception and fraud. The murmurs grew louder. Eyes darted between Marcus, Isabella, and Daniel. As a lawyer, Marcus continued, I've always believed in accountability, and tonight I'd like to hold someone accountable. He stepped aside, gesturing to a large screen that flickered to life. What followed was a presentation of damning evidence. Images of Daniel's fraudulent contracts, transcripts of his deceitful communications, and even video footage of his meetings with Isabella. Gasps and whispers filled the room as the truth unraveled before their eyes. Daniel stood frozen, his face pale. When the screen went dark, Marcus turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Daniel," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You thought you could outmaneuver me, that I wouldn't notice the cracks in your facade. You were wrong." Security personnel approached Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder. He sputtered, his charm evaporating. "This is outrageous. You can't." But he was silenced as law enforcement entered the room, their presence a stark reminder of the consequences Marcus had set in motion. The fallout was swift and brutal. Daniel was arrested that night, his fraudulent dealings laid bare for the world to see. Within days, his property venture collapsed entirely, leaving him bankrupt and disgraced. For Isabella, the public exposure of her involvement was devastating. Though Marcus had ensured her role was framed as one of manipulation rather than malice, she still faced the judgment of their peers. Friends, who had once adored her, now avoided her. Invitations stopped arriving. Her social media accounts became battlegrounds of vitriol. Weeks later, Marcus sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of himself and Isabella from happier times. The justice he'd pursued had come at a cost. His reputation was intact, his finances secured, and his dignity restored. But the scars of betrayal remained. Isabella knocked on the door before entering, her face pale but determined. "Marcus," she said, sitting across from him, "I've made an appointment with a counselor. I need to fix myself, for myself." Marcus nodded, appreciating her honesty. "That's a start." She hesitated. "Do you think there's a chance for us?" The question lingered in the air. Marcus took a deep breath. "I don't know, but if there is, it will take time. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight." Isabella nodded, her eyes glistening. "I understand." As she left the room, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. He had won the battle, but the war within himself was far from over. Justice had been served, but at what cost?